Good morning. Welcome to the ninth edition of the Chaos Workshop, Concepts, Actions, Objects Workshop. The acronym Chaos was not meant to indicate the organization of this workshop, which is perfect, but perhaps more some of the chaotic ideas that we have about the mind and the brain. In any case, this is the ninth edition, as I've said, of a very successful workshop series. Many people like it, and they come back every year, which is always a great pleasure to see them back. Just one important announcement. I already said that this is the ninth year, which for those of us who have learned to count means next year is the 10th year. And the 10th year we were hoping to do some special meeting. We don't know exactly yet the format. And so we welcome all suggestions, recommendations on what we can do to have a great meeting and party. So please send your suggestions or tell us in voice to the organizers. The organizers are, as you know, Mario Spilin, Sharon Thompson-Schill, Mel Goodale, Alex Martin, and myself, and Brett Mahon, who couldn't be here. So please, if you have any suggestions, ideas on how we can celebrate the 10th anniversary, let us know. What can I say? What more can I say? This is the one meeting I go to regularly. I don't like going to scientific meetings, but this has got the right format. The format is very simple. Speakers are allowed to speak for 45 minutes, and then the chair of the session tells the person to stop talking at 45 minutes exactly and takes away the mic. And the mic then is given to the audience to ask questions, and we have a full 30 minutes for discussion. This is important. When we first thought of organizing this workshop, the thing that we all seemed to miss was the fact that people would get up, they would speak, they would say things that perhaps you didn't agree with, but you had no chance to say, wait a minute, I don't agree with that. And why are you saying what you're saying? It doesn't follow from the data you presented. It is really wonderful to see the kind of interactions we have here. The interactions can be tough, but they're very friendly. And so I encourage you all to participate in the discussion. So we can, with this said, we can begin. Mel Goodale will chair the first session. Thank you and welcome.
Welcome everybody. Our first speaker is Ori Friedman from the University of Waterloo. 45 minutes, Ori.
Is that on? Okay. I'm terrified that I'm going to be too loud because I'm an incredibly loud speaker and I'm used to like lecturing, you know, like for 500, 300, whatever, and I don't use microphones. So I hope I'm not too loud. Also, if at any point I say something that makes no sense, make a face that lets me know, okay? And then, or just let me know I'm making no sense. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about ownership of property and how kids think about that. And it's obvious that this topic is a bit of an outlier here. So is this population. I mean, I looked at the list of topics, I looked at the methods, children and ownership didn't seem to fit. So I'm going to spend a minute, at least a minute, talking to you about why you should care about this topic, okay? So why ownership? Why should we care about ownership at all? And what's this workshop called? It's called Concepts, Actions, Objects, right? If you think about it, and this is like so basic, but I think it's something we overlook, right? We live in a world surrounded by objects, right? And we're moving through this world and we're interacting with the objects. But really, if even in this, actually in this room, how many objects are in this room? A lot, right? There's all the chairs, there's your clothing, your computers and your backpacks and so on. How many of those objects can I freely access? Almost none, right? When I leave this room, what am I going to leave with? The stuff I came with, right? I'm not going to take these chairs, I'm not going to take this like monitor, I'm not going to take your wallets, I'm not going to take your jackets, right? Why not? I want that stuff, right? I could sell it, I can make a lot of money. Why am I not going to take it? Because it's not mine, because other people have ownership of it, right? This happens every day, right? Anywhere I go to a store, I see lovely stuff. Do I take this stuff? No, I leave it. Why not? It's not mine. Again, more ownership. Does this convince you that ownership is important? I hope so. What else can you do with ownership? It's not just for guiding my own behavior, right? It's also for predicting your behavior. Because not only can I predict that when I leave, I'm going to leave with the stuff I came with, I can predict very, very clearly what you're going to do. So for example, if Sharon were to go to the bathroom, for example, I can predict with really high accuracy that nobody's going to go rifling through her bag. Why? Ownership. Does this make sense? I can use it so it motivates my behavior, and I can use it to predict your behavior. So it's important. So this is the question. Right here, I've tried to represent the question that I care the most about. And I'm going to present two views. They're not the only two possible views. They're sort of they're not even full extremes, but they're sort of extremes, and we could imagine a lot of moderate positions. We could also imagine some positions even further out. But I'm just going to set them out. So these are questions about, or these are positions on what is ownership. What is ownership, or what's the psychological basis of ownership? So on the one hand, I've got a traffic signal. And what I'm trying to say there is, that's an artifact, right? That's a human-made cultural artifact with legal ramifications that govern how we drive. But again, it's human-made. It's entirely human-made, right? You could imagine that ownership rules are kind of like traffic rules. They're these human-made conventions, like legal conventions, social conventions, which we learn in a cultural way, and that's all ownership is. That could be everything ownership is, okay? Cultural creation. The other possibility, and I've never found a picture that really conveys this very well, but I've got a bird there. Why? Maybe ownership has a more natural, organic basis. Maybe it's a natural outgrowth of our psychology or of our experience in the world, and maybe our notions of ownership would exist without much culture at all, maybe with no culture. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense to talk about humans with no culture, but maybe we don't need very much at all for there to be ownership rules. And that, some people assume right away, they just assume from the beginning, no, it has to be a cultural invention. We do not know that. That is simply not known yet. And here's what I want to do. I'm going to present some research that I kind of hope, I'm not going to prove anything to you for sure, but I hope it kind of leans you in this direction a little bit by the end, that you see maybe this is true. Maybe ownership is not just a matter of legal conventions. Does that make sense as a plan? Yeah? Okay, good. So how am I going to, okay, and now, next thing, the method. I study kids. This is one of mine a couple of years ago. Why study kids when you're trying to answer this question? It's not the only method you could use. There's actually many other methods. But I think because studying children gives you some ability to answer this question. Why? If ownership is a cultural convention, you would expect that young kids, I'm talking like 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, would have a very limited understanding of it, and they would acquire an understanding of these rules in a kind of a piecemeal, gradual way. If you have children, think about money. How easily do children learn about money, and how quickly? It's very slow, and it's a kind of protracted thing where they've got to learn the names of the coins. That takes a while. They even have to understand what's going on in a store transaction. That takes a while. They learn about this very, very gradually. Traffic rules too. Like imagine, how long does it take to learn these rules? Right? Some of these signs, I don't know what they mean even now, because I don't fully drive, it's true. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if there's this kind of more natural basis to ownership, you might think that there are core principles of it, some very general, broad principles that might be apparent even in very young children, before they've had much cultural exposure, okay? So we might see some early competence and evidence for general principles. I hope this dichotomy makes sense, and now you can understand why I study children. Okay. So, let me see how much time I have. I'm losing time quickly. I'm going to try to go over these questions, okay? Here's what I'm going to try to do. In the first half, I'm going to look at how children answer the first 3 questions. For an object, is it owned? Whose is it if it is owned, and why does it belong to that particular person? Okay? And I'm going to suggest that all three questions have one broad principle that kind of informs them. Okay? There's one kind of general principle that might underlie a lot of these judgments when children are making these kinds of judgments. Then, if I have time, which I'm not so sure I will, I'll try to talk about how children think about ownership rights and talk about a completely different principle that might govern there. But in the end, I'm really trying to talk about kind of two broad influences or principles that govern children's thinking about ownership. So, is it owned? This is a basic question, right? If I'm on a subway and I see a magazine next to some people, what do I have to decide? And let's say I want to read the magazine. I have to decide, does it belong to someone? Or basically, is it nobody's? Is there something going off there? Yeah, I guess there is. Is it entertaining? Okay. It is. All right. Okay, I'll compete with it. Okay, so I've got to decide, is it owned? Now, how do I make these judgments? Again, I can do this very, very quickly. Like I'm walking through a park, right? If I see a pine cone on the ground, snap judgment. It's nobody's. If I want this pine cone, I can take it home. But let's say I see a wallet on the ground, in the exact same position. Very quickly, I can also say, that belongs to someone. Someone lost that, right? How am I making these snap judgments? So I think you can do it. I mean, there's probably a lot of ways you make these judgments. Like it's going to be a complicated question in the full analysis. But I think a quick thing you can do is like you could do it very quickly. Just like you don't even have to speak out loud, but just if I'm going to point to an object and you just tell me is it owned by someone or not, okay? So the ball, does that belong to someone? Just, how about the teddy bear, the rock, the pine cone? You can do this, right? You can do it very, very quickly. How are you doing it? One thing you might be doing is you might be thinking in terms of artifacts, human-made artifacts, and natural kinds. Okay? I think that's probably what we're doing. We're doing something like that. So all those things up there, those are human-made artifacts. All of those things have human history, right? They would not exist if not for the fact that someone made them. And as soon as that person makes them, they're in the world of owned things. Usually the creator or whoever the creator works for owns it, and then it gets sold to a store and so on. There's this kind of human history there, and that typically means ownership. So when you see that kind of thing, for that reason alone, you might be thinking this belongs to someone. These things over here, they could have human history. Like it could be that someone, picked up this seashell and bought it at a store. But they don't have to have human history, right? Even if there were no humans at all, even if we were all wiped out or never existed, these things would still be around, right? So because of that, they don't have to have human history. At face value, there's no real reason to assume that they're owned. Okay. Psychologists like data. Here's some data. So what we did was, in a whole bunch of studies, I'm going to just give you like a brief smattering of the studies, we showed children ages 3 to 5 objects one at a time. And we just asked them in different ways, does this object belong to someone, yes or no? And this is what you get, okay? The pattern is always the same. Higher means yes, it's owned on the y-axis. Lower means no, it's not owned, okay? And what you see is the blue bar is artifacts, okay? Those are all the human-made things. The red bar are natural kinds, and the midpoint on this, because we had 5 is 2.5, okay? What you can see a few things is, first of all, at all of those ages, and I won't go into the details, but basically at age 4, age 5, and even at age 3, you get whopping differences, right? Where the kids are saying, yes, the artifacts are owned. You just show them an object, yes, it belongs to someone. You show them a natural kind, no, it does not. So right away that shows they can make these judgments, and they seem to be sensitive to this distinction between artifacts and natural kinds. They're considering object kind. Okay. Now, you might say this has nothing to do with this history principle you're talking about, because really kids have seen these objects many, many, many times. These are all familiar objects. And maybe they're just doing some kind of statistical calculation, like I've seen lots of pine cones, no one was very interested in them. They probably don't belong to anyone. I've seen lots of shoes, people were very interested in those might belong to people. So we showed children unfamiliar objects next, okay? Here are unfamiliar objects we showed the children, same exact task. Does it belong to someone or not? And with these, you cannot simply say, I've seen these many times before. We even confirmed from the kids, they have not, like a different group of kids, that they had not seen these before. And you basically get similar findings. Again, the blue bars for artifacts are higher. The kids are more likely to say that the artifacts are owned than the natural kinds, even though they're unfamiliar. One thing you do see, though, which was kind of a disappointment, was that before age 6, the artifact bars are kind of chancy. They're kind of like at the baseline. Like the kids are very mixed. That was a bit of, we could discuss reasons about why that is later. However, we then did a follow-up experiment where we gave them this historical information. Because if I think that kids are thinking about, at some level, object history, maybe if we tell them this is made by people or it's not made by people, that will sway their judgments. So we said things like this is a cham for the artifact, people make chams, or for the natural kinds, we told them people do not make these. And it affects performance. The bars might not look that different, but now those blue bars are above chance. It's not stupendously great, but still you're seeing this difference. Okay, so again, this is further evidence that, first of all, that kids are making this distinction for for familiar and unfamiliar natural kinds and artifacts, and also that they're considering object history. Okay, so it's consistent with this historical principle. Is this making sense so far? Are we good, roughly, some sense? I'm not so sure. Okay, let's keep going. The next kind of judgment, whose is it? So it's one thing to say, yes, that red bag on the ground belongs to someone. It's a whole other thing to figure out whose it is. If I want to borrow an object, if I want to ask a question about it, who's the best person to go to? Usually the owner, right? So how do I figure out whose something is? And there's there's a million methods you can use. Like, first of all, the very fact that you're holding something right now is a pretty good indication that you're probably the owner, right? That's an example. Same thing if someone says, that's Sally's book, that's a good way to do it. We can also use gender stereotypes. So for example, the floral pattern there tells me, it could be a man's for sure, it could be, but it's maybe a little less likely that I'd think that. Okay, one method that I've looked at is this, and I'll just talk you through the task. This is what you show children, okay? So you go to a daycare or a preschool, and you show this to kids age 2, 3, 4, it doesn't matter. You tell them a story like this. Here's a girl, here's a boy, there's a ball, and the ball and you say, first the girl plays with the ball. That's all you say. First the girl plays with the ball, then the boy plays with the ball. Whose ball is it? That's it. And you guys have to turn off your brains a little. You can't be too smart. If you're really smart, you're going to see there's no correct answer. Like it could be anything. It could be it's neither of them and both of theirs. It doesn't, you know. But what do people do if they're not trying to be too smart? They pick the girl. They pick the one who had it first. By had it first, whoever was holding it, playing with it, touching it, using it first, that's the one they pick. This is a reliable thing. I found it a bunch of studies. It's been replicated since by other labs. It's reliable. You can also do it on adults. They also do it. Okay? It's a very consistent kind of thing. If you just tell someone this kind of task, whose is it? If it's an adult, they might say there's no correct answer, but if you force them, they pick the first. Again, there's no correct answer. Now, why are people showing this bias to pick the first person who had the object if there's no correct answer? That's kind of the question. And let me just see how much time I have. And I think the answer is something like this. And I think it's historical reasoning. Again, what is this historical reasoning I'm talking about? Again, think back to the artifacts. So the artifacts, like a human-made thing like my phone, this has human history, right? Someone had made this, someone might have bought this, so there was a reason to think it's owned, right? For a pine cone, there's no reason to assume any human history, so no reason to think ownership. How does human history enter here? Does this make sense as history now, like you think about the past? Well, look at this is the story again. I'm just telling you the exact story I told the kids, okay? First the girl plays with it, then the boy plays with it. Okay, now, what do we know? Who had it the minute before the story started? Well, probably the girl. There's some reason, like if you're trying to go back, people talk a lot today about prospection, right? And future thinking, right? You try to imagine the future. How about if you're trying to recreate the past, right? But the second before this story started, she had it, right? Because she already has it now. So we know that at least the moment before, if you're trying to construct backwards, you've got evidence that she had it before. Why? Because she's already holding it. Does that make sense? Okay. The boy, there's no reason to think that he had prior contact with this object. So if your brain is doing this kind of very automatic calculation backwards, that's the person who had it before. She's the best candidate for having bought it or received it as a gift or having brought it to the park or wherever they are. Does this make sense? I hope it makes sense. How do you test this idea that kids are maybe like making this inference backwards? Again, I've got more experiments I'm going to show you. Here's how you do it. You just add a frame to the story. So I just add a frame. I add a frame where in the beginning, it's between them on the ground. And I say this to children. Okay? Now what should happen? Here, who had it before? Who had it before the story started? We don't know. There's absolutely no basis now for making an inference about the past. And when you compare these two versions of the story, the one where it begins with the girl and the one where it begins, you get this massive difference. And I should stress, up high on that graph are people picking the first possessor, picking the girl, basically. The other kids are not all picking the boy. Some of them are just saying, I don't know. And then you force them to respond, and they say, I don't know again. Okay, there's a mixture of other responses that are going there, but what you see is this decrease in their willingness to pick that person. So again, this is this further evidence that when we're thinking about ownership, one thing that might be guiding a lot, and specifically when we're trying to decide is an object owned or who does it belong to, a thing that's guiding a lot of our judgments is some kind of inference about the past. Sorry, just going to get some water. Okay, I'm going to show you one more piece of evidence in this line, and then we're going to switch gears entirely. So, is it? You know, and the worst thing is that the minute you said it, I believed it. And I actually had to like inhibit it, you know, Dan Gilbert style, you know, like it was true, and then no, he's joking. Okay, so, okay, you also, this is not a common scenario. Like you're not often to explain, like nobody comes up to me and says, Ori, why is this your phone? What makes it yours, right? But you could imagine some kind of like movie where the police walk up to me and they say, what makes it yours? Why is it yours? You know, maybe in some kind of like, I don't know, more repressive government. But we did this with kids, okay? So, and this is research with Shailene, who's supposed to be in here somewhere. I don't see her. There you are, okay. Yes, okay, so we showed kids simple pictures like this, 3, 4, 5, you know, young kids again, and we just told the kids, this is all we told them. This is the girl's hat. Why is it her hat? You can say anything you want. It's like an open-ended explanation task. And then we look at their explanations, and we're just going to see, are they going to refer to the past, right? Are they going to make reference to some past event that makes it hers? And we had other items too, always again, you know, this is a girl, it's her painting, why is it hers? And what you see is 3-year-olds are terrible. This is not surprising because pretty much on any open-ended question you can ask a 3-year-old, any why question, they're always terrible. So it doesn't tell you very much. If you look at 4-year-olds, they talk about the past, and specifically they talk about principles of acquisition. Things like, she found it, she made it, she bought it, someone gave it to her, things like that. And they do so in an appropriate manner. Now you might say, well, what's the big deal here? Maybe whenever you ask kids a why question, they refer to the past, right? Anytime you say why blah, 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 the kids will refer to the past. I mean, you are looking for a cause. It's not true. Because if you say, why does the girl like that? Okay, let's say you don't talk about ownership at all. You say, the girl likes the hat. Why does the girl like the hat? Now nobody talks about the past. Now they'll say it's red, you know, or whatever. Was it red? Yes, red. Okay. So, yeah, there you go. That's it. That's it for the first half of my talk, and I think I'm even on time. So what I'm trying to say is you can take, like it's, you know, we make these ownership judgments on a daily basis very, very, very quickly and often automatically, and we don't really think about it. But it seems like there's this kind of this general historical principle that governs a lot of our judgments about ownership that maybe we weren't even aware of. And that's even present in very, very young kids. Okay. Now I'm going to switch entirely to ownership rights, because it's one thing for me to know that that bag, you know, is not mine and it belongs to someone else. I don't know if everyone can see the bag. It's just so attention-grabbing for me. You don't have to lift it up. It's okay. No, it is though, you know, because it's like bright and colorful, you know. So whatever, you know, maybe or Mel's water. So it's one thing for me to know that that's Mel's water. No, it's not. It's another thing for me to know what that means, right? Because I could be like, yes, that's her bag, and I'm going to take it home now. Right, like a thief, right? And I could think that's okay. So you need to have some notion of what ownership rights, that if it's someone else's, I cannot just help myself to it, okay? And again, if you think that ownership is a cultural convention, where would kids learn about ownership rights from then? What's the most likely place? From their parents, from adults, right? Because how do people learn cultural conventions? From people in the culture who have already learned the conventions, right? Which would be adults in this case. So you'd think that they'd learn that. And there's some reason to doubt that this is how kids get their understanding of ownership rights. I'm not going to prove to you that this is not how they get it, but there's some reason to doubt it. So there's a whole ton of studies that's at this point that suggest that, like, you know, 3, 4, 5-year-olds are sensitive to ownership rights. There's a lot of that. But this is the thing. Although children often uphold ownership rights, adults often don't, particularly with kids. And so I'm going to just tell you very quickly about a study by Hildy Ross. Hildy Ross was a colleague of mine at the University of Waterloo, and I had no idea when I got to Waterloo that she studied ownership. It was like a very weird thing to like, I started researching ownership, but I see these papers by Ross, and I didn't realize that Ross was two doors down. You know, but there it was. She went into kids' homes, okay? She went into the homes of families with 2- and 4-year-olds. And all she did was, it's the kind of research I never looked at, and probably I'm guessing none of you look at. It's like observational research where they don't do an experiment, where they just account how much things happen. But here's what she found, it's really fascinating. She looked at the conflicts between kids where it's like, you know, where like Mel has the water and I'm like, I want it, and we have a squabble, right? And what happens is the parents, first of all, often don't intervene in those squabbles. The parents are right there, they don't always intervene. When they do intervene, there's no pattern to what they do. Sometimes they support the owner and they're like, no, you know, he gets his water. Other times they say, no, Mel, you have to let Ori have it. So and if you're a parent, you know this. There's not that, so she found no consistency. Now, you think about this for a minute. If this is true, I mean, this is the best data we have about what's going on in the home, is her data, okay? And she has a few other studies. But if this is true, that there's no kind of like pattern in what the parents are doing, how are the kids learning about ownership rights if they're getting very inconsistent input, right? Why would kids uphold ownership rights if what they're getting is sometimes the owner wins, sometimes someone else should win, right? How are you getting ownership rights from that? Now, I think you can come up with answers. You can definitely come up with answers like there's other places kids could learn it. But I do think it should give us at least a bit of a pause to think maybe we don't necessarily know where kids are getting the information. Anyway, we wanted to do a study to see, what if you just ask kids about this? If you don't like look at this situation, what do they think with these kinds of situations? So a graduate student, or ex-graduate student, we told kids stories like this. So here's a boy, and he's using a crayon, and he needs it to finish making a card for his mother, and the crayon belongs to the girl, and she wants the crayon back, okay? And then we said, who should get it? So one more time. The boy is using this crayon to make a card, he needs it to finish, and it's the girl's crayon, she wants it back. Who should finish? Or who should get it? Kids pick the owner. These are 3-year-old, you can see it's 3 to 7-year-olds, different shades of blue. The kids, super strong, support the owner. What do adults do? They don't support the owner, right? It's exactly what she found in her observational study, but this is using third-person methodology. So there's something to this where these kids are strongly supporting ownership rights, even though adults don't in this kind of situation. Which again makes you wonder, again, you can come up with answers, but where are kids getting these notions from? Okay, so I'm going to give you, let me see, time. I'm golden. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 possible answers about how children are thinking about ownership rights and where they're coming from, okay? So one possibility, and without worrying about where this comes from, one possibility is that what kids really think when they think about ownership rights is that they've learned a very simple rule. And the rule is, don't let owners lose their stuff. That's what ownership rights are for. We don't want owners to be deprived. We want to protect owners from harmful consequences. So when they see a story like this, where the boy has the crayon and it belongs to the girl, we don't want the girl to be deprived of her property. Okay? We don't want her to be deprived. Why? Because it's hers. And if he keeps it and she wants it, then in a way she's being deprived. So they could be using some very simple rule like that. So one source that says that that's not true are studies that look at how kids predict emotions from harmless, not harmful ownership violations. So here's a study. Told kids a story. This was basically 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, but we later did a version on 2-year-olds. We told the kids a story where there's a boy and he's got a teddy bear, the girl, she's got a teddy bear. The girl goes outside, and then the boy plays with a teddy bear. And in this example, he's playing with the girl's teddy bear. In another example, he plays with his own teddy bear. And we just asked kids, how will the girl feel when she sees that? Now notice, she's not being deprived or harmed in any way. He's not trying to steal the teddy bear, he's not ripping the arms off. He's just playing with it while she is gone. No deprivation. Does this make sense? Okay? What happens is, when the boy plays with the girl's teddy bear, the kids say that she will feel sad or bad. And when he plays with his own, they do not say that, right? They've got some notion that when your ownership rights are violated, in the sense that he's using her stuff without permission, that's like in some sense this wrong thing that has these like negative emotional consequences for you. But this doesn't follow from a rule like, it doesn't follow from a rule like prevent owners from bad consequences, because there's really no bad consequence here. Okay. Actually, I'm going to skip this over. Okay. Actually, no, I will say it. Okay, so here's a second piece of evidence. This one's a little more ambiguous. I think this is a super cool finding. It's a little more ambiguous, but I think it's super cool also. So another kind of source of evidence that children are not using such a simple rule, although again there's two ways of looking at it, is a whole series of studies we did on whether objects are freely interchangeable. So imagine, for example, I have a shovel and my neighbor has a shovel, right? Or actually, yeah, is it okay for me at the end of the day to take my neighbor's shovel and leave my shovel for my neighbor? Because that's a very odd thing to do, even if the two shovels are the same. So even though they're the same object, they might be physically identical, it's very odd to swap them. Does that make sense? Same thing, like let's say we both bought new iPhones, brand new iPhones, we leave the store, you put yours down, I put mine down. Wouldn't it be weird, and we haven't even set them up yet, it'd be very, very odd for me to pick up yours, put it in my pocket, and leave this one for you. Right? They're the same, but you don't do stuff like that, right? Why? If you're simply worried about protecting owners from negative consequences, there's not a real negative consequence because the objects are identical. So we did a whole series of studies showing that kids believe this too. Here's one of them, okay? So, and this is kind of the most extreme. We told kids a story about these two characters. Again, these are very, simple stories. And you can see they both have identical balloons, and we even tell the kids the balloons are identical. And what happens is the boy takes the girl's balloon, and he brings it back to his house. And what happens is it pops, okay? So here's a question. Would it be okay for the girl to take the other balloon? Can she steal back from an owner, basically? Now, if what ownership rights are about is protecting owners from negative consequences, I think kids should be like, yes, it's okay for her to take it back. Why? Because his actions have led to a negative consequence for her, right? The negative consequence is that she has no balloon. So if it's perfectly okay, if the whole point of ownership is protect the owner from negative consequence, then I guess it would be okay for her to take this one. That's how I'm thinking about it. But kids, and I don't know what you're feeling about this situation, but what kids say is, they don't say it's okay. So here, yes would be like a high on the y-axis would be saying, yes, it's okay. Kids are not saying that. Now, on the other hand, imagine that the balloon popped was the other one. So imagine, for example, that the boy steals the girl's balloon, and then his balloon pops. And so would it be okay for the girl to take back the balloon that was hers in the beginning? And now kids would be like, yes, no problem. Okay, so first of all, I think one interesting thing here is that it shows you that kids really do view these identical objects as distinct individuals with different rights over them. That's one thing that shows. But the other is that it's more evidence that for kids, ownership rights are not just about protecting people from negative consequences. Okay, so where are we so far? Let's just think here's the big picture so far. Well, at least where I'm trying to lead you anyway. So far we're at, it's possible at least that kids might not be getting their notions of ownership rights directly from parental input. At least it might be possible. Why? Because when you look in the home, the input is not very clear. That's reason number one. And two, when you actually look at adult intuitions versus children's intuitions, it looks like the children value ownership more strongly than the adults do, which makes it a bit of a conundrum about how they're learning about it from adults. Okay. Of course, that does not prove in any way, shape, or form that kids are not learning about ownership from adults. You could still come up with clever ways. I'm going to try, and we also have found out that they're probably not just doing some simple thing like having a rule like, oh, don't let the owners, protect owners from negative consequences. So what's another possible source for how children are thinking about ownership rights? So here's an answer, okay? And this you have to play along. You can pretend that you're these two characters, okay? So here's the story very quickly. So suppose that this girl has this book, okay? You can imagine you're at a party. Okay, and you've got a book at the party, and some stranger walks up to you, and the stranger just, starts drawing in the book. Is that okay? One more time, okay? You're at a party, you have a book. A stranger walks up to you and starts drawing in your book with a marker. Is that okay? No, that is not cool, right? How about if the stranger just grabs the book? It's a dinner party, not a wild party, okay? The stranger grabs the book and starts waving it around like crazy and running around in circles with it. Is that okay? Nah, maybe at a good party, but it's usually not okay. Okay, but what if you want to do that? What if it's your book and you want to, for whatever reason, start drawing a marker in it? Is that okay? It's okay. You want to okay, you get it. So if it's yours, you can decide to do those things with it, but the stranger cannot. Now, what if you gave the stranger permission? What if you said, hi, attractive stranger, I would very much like it if you scribbled in my book. Does that make it okay? Yes? Okay, you have to play along or it's not going to work. Okay. All right. Now think about your arm. Okay, this is the point. Think about your arm. So you're at the party, and some stranger comes along, again, a calm party, not a wild party, and starts writing on your arm with a marker. Is that cool? Not really cool. But are you allowed to start writing on your own arm with a marker? Is that cool? Is that okay? Yes. And what if you say, hello, attractive stranger, would you please, draw my arm with a marker? It's a form of flirtation, in fact, right? So it's okay. So the point is, we talk about ownership rights. Like there are, entire books about ownership rights. And, it's a property law is a whole area of law, but it may turn out, and this is not my idea, like if you go back to John Locke, the philosopher, it's an old idea. It could be that really we have the same notions of bodily rights and property rights. And some people put one as more dominant, and and the others the other. Some people think that property rights are more basic, and then we apply them to our bodies. Other people think that the bodily rights are more basic, and you can apply it to property. Or maybe there's just more general principle. Okay, but if it's true, this is the thing. I think it's very hard to imagine any kind of society at all without some basic notions of bodily rights. It'd be a very weird thing if I'm walking down the street, right, and a complete stranger just stops me from moving, right, and interferes with me. That's not you're not going to get any kind of society off the ground like that, right? So there's some reason to think that these kind of notions of you can decide what you're going to do, and other people need permission or they're interfering with you, that's a very, very basic idea. So what I wanted to see is maybe this is where our notions of proper ownership rights are coming from this basic notion that we've got ownership rights and body rights, and there's this kind of common principle. So I did a study, and how am I on time? Totally good. Okay, so I did a study on 4-year-olds at first and action evaluations. So we told them stories with these kinds of stimuli. These are just kind of sort of samples of the stimuli. So we tell them stories there are different examples. So there'd be a boy and a girl, and for example, we might say something like the boy wants to comb the boy combs the teddy bear's hair, and it's his teddy bear, or he could comb his own hair, right? So he could either comb his teddy bear's hair or his own hair, or he could comb the girl's hair or her teddy bear's hair. Does that make sense? So sometimes he's directing actions to a body, and it's either his body or the girl's body, or he's directing very similar actions to property, and again, it's either his property or the girl's property. And we also said whether the girl approved or not. So she's okay with it or she's not okay with it. Okay? That's the basic setup of the design. So it's kind of complicated. And then for each action, we had kids do an evaluation of how good or bad it was. And the way they did that was with this scale. So there's the negative end of the scale and the positive end of the scale. And here's what you get. So this is for objects, okay? This is when you're asking about the teddy bears, combing the teddy bear's hair, not people's hair, okay? So, okay, it's quite a handful here. And this is when the girl approves of the action, and this is when she disapproves. And let's assume that the boy is always doing the action, okay? So, when the boy is acting on his own when the boy is acting on either his own teddy bear or on the girl's doll, those are the two bars at the very top there. If the girl says it's okay, then it's okay. Okay? If on the other hand, if the girl disapproves of the actions, you get this funny thing where if he combs his own teddy bear's hair and the girl disapproves, the kids are kind of at chance. Which I was surprised by that. But because you think really if I want to comb my teddy bear's hair, what does it matter what you think? It's my thing. But kids did show some effect of that. But where you see the really big effect is really if I'm combing the girl's teddy bear's hair, and she disapproves, that's a bad thing. That's the equivalent of me writing on your book, and you don't want me to, right? That's a bad thing to do. So far, there should be nothing too surprising here. This is the part that I found kind of interesting, though. This was about the objects, right? The teddy bear and the doll. Okay, I hope the overall pattern is clear. Now let's switch to the body parts. So now we're talking about combing a person's hair. I'm combing my own hair, or I'm combing your hair. And either you want me to or you don't want me to. You get the same exact pattern. Like when you stick it in the analysis, there is absolutely no effect in this study of whether it's an object or a body part. None. Okay? And so it suggests that in these very young children and 4-year-olds, which is really the youngest kids you could use this methodology with, you couldn't go any younger, it suggests that they're thinking about like these bodily rights and these property rights in the same way. And if you think about that, what that kind of implies is they don't necessarily need to learn. This is like the big picture here. They don't necessarily need to learn about ownership rights from their parents, at least not as ownership rights. Because, for example, here's another thing they could do. Maybe they could get some notion of body rights. And we could talk about where that might come from, right? But like, if you look at the work of Kylie Hamlin on Inference, it looks like that kind of notion of body rights might be very, very early. Something very similar to that anyway. And then you could just on your own basically extend your notion of body rights to property. You don't necessarily need to learn it. That's the point, because this general principle that you can control what's yours, like your body, could be extended to property. By the way, we did a follow-up with adults, 89 adults on MTurk. And you know, here's what I was expecting. I should stress. I was expecting that the adults would show a different pattern from the kids, but again, that it would be the same pattern across both. Or maybe I thought, you know, really, with the human body, it takes on a lot of nuance after puberty, right? Like, I mean, once you think about like sexualization of the body, you know, a lot of things change. Although there are stories about kids, it was exact same stories. In any case, there was no differences at all. Like again, the adults were just, I was floored. This is not what I was expecting. I mean, I thought that there was going to be parallels across the two. That's fine, but they were not even any different than the kids. It was almost like, I mean, it's weird. Like one is kids in daycares, the other is adults on MTurk. Not a difference at all. Again, so I was floored. And I should just stress, it's not a fluke because we've done a whole, I'm not going to go into the details, but we did a bunch more studies, again, where we compared objects and body parts, and it just never matters. And you can go at different ages and it just doesn't matter. It's always basically the same. Okay, so that's actually all I'm going to say today. So the big summary here is we looked at a lot of different kinds of judgments about ownership, right? First we looked at the judgments about, like, is something owned and whose is it and why is it owned? And we saw there might be this kind of historical principle, this tendency to look to the past to make these judgments. Then we looked at judgments about ownership rights, and it looks like it could be that the way that kids are making these judgments is by thinking about bodily rights, so they don't need to learn specific principles that apply to property. And so I hope I'll convince you, you don't necessarily need to come to ownership by learning a ton of cultural conventions. A few broad principles, which might be more basic, could do. Thanks.
Well, thank you for keeping the time, keeping.
I'm even ahead of time.
You were very efficient and finished ahead of time, which is given that Alfonso started us off rather late. But questions? Yes, Brian.
So you made a point both in the beginning and at the end about the children looking into the past to kind of determine who is the owner of something. But looking into the past is kind of actually a complicated way of determining ownership because it takes well, maybe not long-term, but at least moderately long-term memory of what happened before, and then also inferring in your task into the past previous to what they even know. Whereas it seems like a much simpler thing to say, well, whoever's holding this last is probably the one that should own this. And so it's not published yet, but the work I was talking to earlier actually shows that the rhesus tend to show this more simplistic last owner type of result, where whoever was the last person to possess the thing or show ownership is the one that they are more likely to avoid. So what I'm wondering is, do you think maybe earlier children that are not as verbal would show a more simplistic version, and that there is some learning that's going on here, because you're dealing with a set of kids that can interact with you on this verbal level to answer these types of questions. But maybe if you were looking at 1- and 2-year-olds and trying a nonverbal task, they might not be able to do this inference into the past.
So it's speculative. I mean, one thing to know is we actually did do it with 2-year-olds. So 2-year-olds do not pick the last person who had the object as the owner. They pick the first person. So I can't, it's entirely possible that if we went low enough that in fact they would do what you're saying, but it's hard to know. But even if they did, it wouldn't imply learning, right? Because you could imagine that even a principle like that, like you might have a principle like look at the past, but of course that's going to take cognitive machinery to actually enact what that principle involves. Very similar like to attributing a false belief. You might have the concepts necessary, but you might not have like the, say the inhibitory or executive mechanism, machinery needed to make that inference, right? So I think there's two separate things. One is what young kids do, and the question is would it require learning? Yeah. I don't know. It's also possible though, and this is like I said that I think that kids are using the past. It could be that there's more and less effortful ways of doing that. So you could have shortcuts that basically give you an answer that's equivalent to inferring the past without actually doing the complicated task of actually imagining the past. And it could be that that's what it's explaining a lot of what the young kids are doing. Okay, Jerry, I guess you're...
So I really like the idea that the body parts, having ownership or inevitable ownership of your body parts then may transfer to objects. But how do children then understand transference of objects? So how is it that they understand that when I give them something, it's now theirs and not mine? Or at what point does that kick in? Yeah. That the body part story would say, actually, this should come in really, really late because we do not transfer body parts.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so it's a tricky thing, and here's the reason why. Some of the studies suggested that actually the kids do have difficulty with that. So, and my grad student, Shay, claims that she can't replicate, but I don't know, like, so a number of different labs had stories where if you made it clear that one person owned an object, and then they transferred ownership to some second person, and then you asked who it was, the kids were often at chance when there were 3 and even sometimes 4. And so there was still, and they're having a lot of difficulty not picking the first person. We only, at least in my experience, we only got that to disappear when you made it very, very clear that it was like a gift situation, like it was a wrapped birthday gift and it was a birthday party. But if you think about it, in those scenarios, it's not really clear that you think that the giver actually owns the gift. Because if I'm, like, let's say I'm going to buy like a gift for Mel, it could be that children don't think of the gift as mine and then his. They might think of it as his even before I've given it, because I bought it for him to begin with. But in the clearest cases where first I own it and then I transfer it to kids, it did seem that they might have difficulty. But I'm not 100% sure that that's true. The second thing, I've thought a lot about this because it's a great point. Another thing I've thought about is this. Let's say that kids, I think it depends a little bit also on whether this is going to be difficult, on what the rule we have or what the principles we use when we're thinking about body parts. Here's an example. Like, it could be that we actually have a very complicated set of rules that govern what can be done with body parts. But it's also possible that we've got a very simple principle that governs our judgments, like this. It could be, if it's my body, I decide what happens to it. And so let's say, if I move my hand like this, I've decided what's happened to it. Now, if Mel comes over and starts shaking my hand like this, I'm not deciding what's happening to my body, he's deciding. So that would violate that principle. Similarly, on the other hand, if I say to him, you may do as you wish with my arm, and then he does that, I guess I've decided in a kind of a roundabout way. Now, why am I talking with this? Because if that was the principle that I had, if it's mine, I decide what happens to it, then it could be that I've decided that ownership of it's transferred, and that's actually a decision within my compass. So I don't know that would, so if that was the principle you had, ownership transfers might not be difficult to understand after all. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Marlene.
Thanks. So I'm going to suggest that we actually don't need to appeal to explanations of ownership, to account for anything that you have. So let's try this and see how far we can get. Yeah. So the first part of your talk was all about sort of man-made versus artifact, and only man-made things can be owned.
Or are owned.
Or are owned.
Like
okay.
That's your default assumption anyway. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest that the kids really just use the geometry to make that distinction. It actually is not about whether it's owned or not. It really just has to do about whether or not they are artifacts or natural kinds. The second part of your talk is all about, if somebody has the ball and then somebody else takes it, etc. I'm going to suggest that a general principle like spatiotemporal contiguity may suffice to account for all of your findings. And that is, if somebody held it and it was attached to them and then they let it go, or gave it to somebody else, the ownership comes from the proximity between whatever it is that somebody has as sort of an extension of their own arm. And so body parts and objects are sort of all of the same sort of sort, because it really is governed by spatiotemporal proximity. And in fact, the reason that these kids appear not to learn this from adults, like in your, adult, when they go into the home and adults show a different profile to the kids, is because adults can override spatiotemporal contiguity because of social convention. But the kids are so bound, like the rhesus monkey, are bound by these very, very fundamental principles of sort of sensory motor proximity. I have one other quick question,
Can I
respond
to those two?
Yeah. It's just an extent. It's a prediction, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think we've ruled it all out, although maybe I'm misunderstanding. So, for example, for the artifacts and natural kinds, we ask control questions, right? So, I mean, you said that they could be doing it without ownership. I don't really understand what that means. We're asking them about I mean, I agree that they're probably thinking about the categories artifact and natural kind, and it's possible that the way they're actually thinking about it is not those categories, but it could be that there's certain, I guess, visual properties that artifacts have in common that, in fact, let you identify it as an artifact. I think that's probably true. I mean, there is work on that. But when you say that without ownership, I don't quite understand what you're suggesting.
I'm suggesting that they actually don't even understand what ownership means, and they're doing it fundamentally on the distinction between man-made and natural kinds.
Right, but
and even when you give them new objects and you label them, they basically just absorb those into the distinction between man-made and natural kind.
Right. I mean, I think if we were to look at the wealth of studies that, including the ones that I have not talked about, it's pretty clear that kids know a lot about ownership. That's the first thing. I mean, I could just go over task after task after task. At some point, at some point, I think you'd be left. In fact, because the kids have generally responded like adults on most of the tasks, you'd be left saying that adults don't understand ownership, which maybe is a position. But also, I should stress, we've asked control questions, and I didn't give you all the controls. So, for example, here's a task I didn't give you. We showed kids, again, unfamiliar artifacts and natural kinds, okay? And we showed a picture of a woman's face. And we just, they'd be together, okay? There'd be an artifact here, a natural kind here, we'd swap them, and we tried to make them both colorful and attractive. And so for some of the kids, we said, here is Sally, which one of these objects is Sally's? Kids, again, they easily pick the artifacts, right, over the natural kinds. But other kids, we asked different questions. Other kids, we said, which one does Sally like more? Now, if you were simply thinking in terms of these artifacts are they're human-made, so they're associated with people, so I'm just going to pick them, that's not what happens at all. Now, Sally often likes the attractive natural kind. And in fact, there's no difference at all between those two. I mean, we could have picked items anyway, but we did not see a bias towards pick the artifact. So I think that suggests that there's something specific to ownership. Now, in terms of the spatial contiguity claims, we'd have to look at the items. And again, there's lots of control tests I'm not telling you about, which I'm happy to. So let's go back to them, I guess, because I don't really understand it. So over here, right, in this task, first she has it, then he has it. They both have it for an equal... sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. That is too bad. Here we go. Okay. Let's see. Okay, over here. So the girl has it, then the boy has it. We ask whose it is. So I'm sorry, I don't know. Oh, by the way, we did versions where it even stayed with the boy. He actually has it at the end. And you ask, whose is it? And for every age except for 2, they still pick the first person. So if spatial contiguity was the big thing, why would you, I don't know why you predicted, why anyone predicted they're going to pick the first person.
I don't deny that there's something about the history that's associated with this. I'm just not sure that we need to appeal to the concept of ownership in order to be able to account for this. I mean, there's hysteresis. Let's imagine there's
again-
hysteresis in the
But
system.
again, you can ask other questions. So if you ask which one of them likes it more, you do not get the same patterns. So again, if you simply thought that they've got this just general, like, imagine when you hear ownership, you just hear some kind of like human object, you don't even know what it means, right? You'd expect very similar answers for other questions, but you do not get similar answers for other questions. In fact, with liking, you get 50-50. Or actually, you can even hedge it so that you'll get a bias to pick based on like slight gender stereotypes. So I don't think that the overall pattern of findings, I mean, obviously in a 45-minute talk, I couldn't give you all the controls,
Sure.
but I don't think that that's really
Okay,
viable.
great. So can I just ask you one quick prediction, and
That's
then
up to
I'll
Mel.
cede the microphone. So is it your prediction that because man-made items are not considered ownable?
No, I didn't say that. They're definitely considered ownable. If you tell a child about a rock, this rock belongs to a girl, they can easily say that it's hers and that she, it's not that they're not ownable, it's just, what's your just quick guess about whether it's owned or not? Your quick guess, if there's no other information, is that a man-made object is not owned. But they definitely can view them as ownable.
So I was just wondering if, for example, you used a pine cone or something, a leaf, rather than a soccer ball, would you expect in these kinds of experiments, do you get the same kind of manifestation of ownership under these kinds of conditions for natural kinds, which you might not expect to see?
No, I think I would expect to see it,
Okay.
though. And actually, it's a good question. I think it would depend on whether possession cues versus, I guess, kind cues are more dominant. So if you thought that possession cues are more dominant, then again, the fact that it starts out possessed is already reason to think that she's got some history with it, which would be enough to suggest that, I think it's a very interesting question, by the way. I think it's a very interesting question, but I think it would be explainable either way. I don't think it would like somehow violate some kind of, I wouldn't be like terribly miffed if it was the same or different, but I would find it interesting.
Jorn.
Thanks. So your tasks were all asked, the data you showed is all asked from the third person perspective. So they make judgment about two other people. So how, when they make judgment about themselves, is it okay, so I own this, is it okay for him to take it? Or he owns it, is it okay for me to take it? How asymmetric are their judgments early on, and how does it develop? Do you have any insight?
So my lab is, that's great. My lab has mostly done these third-person tasks, and the truth is, I was worried that if we did tasks where there's self-interest, there's a lot of reasons when there's self-interest why, you might see worse findings, right? Because, like for example, if I really want to play with your toy, I might ignore the fact that it's yours because I really have strong motivation, but that doesn't mean, but it turns out that they're actually very good. So the lab that's probably most relevant is the Tomasello lab, it's really, I guess Federico Rossano, who's joining UCSD, like he's done some tasks with really very first-person measures. So they'll put the child in a room, and then they'll have like a puppet basically try to steal the child's toy or steal someone else's toy. And then they'll see that the children will actually spontaneously protest. So they'll actually like complain. But they haven't done all the different judgments that we've done. So basically the answer is yes, you do see some respect for ownership rights in very young children with first-person measures, but there's fewer studies like that, so we don't know too much about it.
Brian?
I have two related questions having to do with what I took to be the central theme of your talk, which is the rejection of this idea that learning about ownership is some form of cultural construct or something like that. And what draws both questions together is the idea that if you really want to understand this, you need to compare ownership to something else. So question number one, you did that in the beginning of your talk when you contrasted ownership with money and traffic signs. Maybe there are independent reasons why kids don't have as much experience with those particular sets of regularities. And so I'm trying to think of like what things might we think that are really good candidates for being complete cultural constructs that nevertheless a 4-year-old might have quite a lot of competence with. And maybe something like learning about the regularities and rules involved in going to a restaurant. So having gone to restaurants recently with many 4-year-olds, I hereby attest to the fact that they've got that down completely. And I wonder if that kind of thing calls into question the inference from if you've got it down by around age 4, then maybe that's evidence against it being a cultural construct. So the first question is, what is the difference between what kids know about ownership and what they know about how to behave in a restaurant. Second question, which is related, for many things that we think are not cultural constructs, one bit of evidence for that is that you can find neuropsychological conditions where that thing has a very specific impairment. So if you think morality is not a cultural construct, then maybe you're impressed by psychopaths who seem to just completely lack something in the realm of morality. Or if you think theory of mind is not a cultural construct, then you think maybe autism spectrum disorder. Is there any candidate for a neuropsychological impairment of ownership? And if not, is that troubling?
Yeah, those are both great questions. Okay, so about the restaurants, we haven't studied, and maybe I should be the one doing it, I guess is your implication, what kids really know about how to behave in a restaurant or what's done in a restaurant. You're right. I mean, I view all of this stuff as in its infancy. I tried to make that clear ahead of time. I do not think in any way that I've proven, like in some kind of, here's an example. If we can show that like newborns can, have this sensitivity to human faces, and there's still debate about whether that's learned or not, right? Or if it's in specific spaces, I don't think anything I can do is going to convince, like at least with this kind of data, is going to convince people this is not learned at all. It's more like these are the questions that motivate it. But I don't know really what kids know about restaurant scripts that much. It's possible actually that it does show this more piecemeal kind of development, nonetheless.
But I just told you I'd been to a restaurant once with a 4-year-old, and they were fine. Yeah. So
well, I guess
isn't that settled?
Yeah. And why haven't you submitted that to nature?
No. So basically, I think you're right. That would be a good next step. Would be to find. But we need to find a domain that's kind of like structured similarly, because that's a problem with all these things, right? Like, let's say I pick something like road signs. There's so many differences between that and ownership. Why would you think that a child would be exposed to road
Or maybe
signs?
just pick. Well, I don't know. What is your intuition? What is a domain that you really think we would all agree is definitely a cultural construct? What is the earliest such domain that kids have down?
Clothing might be one that's like.
Yeah. So what's the difference between clothing and ownership?
Yeah, I'd have to think about it, to be honest. I mean, again, the inferences you're making with clothing are so different, though. It's kind of like a hard comparison. Sure. But no, I think it's a fair point. So no, I don't think I've got a great answer. Like, I don't have like lots of studies comparing ownership to some very similar domain that's clearly a cultural construct, and I don't think it's even that easy to think about one. But that would definitely be one way to approach it. But back to the second question. Again, this is something I've thought a lot about, and I've always been hoping for this kind of like, it's like the equivalent of autism for ownership, and we don't know. I mean, if the picture here was correct, you could imagine that there would be two separate pieces, right? You could imagine some people who would have a hard time being able to make inferences of ownership, so they'd have a difficult time with the history piece. But you could have a completely different part where people have trouble with the body rights side, right? Like the ownership rights. Because there's no necessary reason to think that those two things hang together. But I should also stress, though, so I worked with Alan Leslie, and so if you think
that makes two of us.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this one. So I see exactly where you're coming from, but I don't think that I didn't say innate. I said non-cultural, and I think there's a huge difference there. So I'll give an example. So, and this is the kind of thing I don't, usually want to build into a talk, but I'm happy to talk about it after. So you could imagine you don't believe anything's innate, right? or very little, like you're some kind of, like embodied theorist, right? You might think that some notion of body rights, I don't know, you can imagine the notion of body rights comes about from control of your body. So you could think that I'm not saying I believe this, but I'm just trying to give an example. You could think that your first person experience in the body gives you some notion of bodily rights, which first you create for yourself. It's constructed, though, experientially, not innate, right? And that is not like pre-specified by something like Tom or something like that, like theory of mind module or something like that. And then it could be that after you've created this notion of bodily rights for yourself, there's a step where you extend it to other people. And it could be that after you've done those two things, then you extend it to objects. It would not be cultural. None of that's cultural. It would be based on your first person experience in a body. Okay, so it's possible that ownership actually comes from, I'm open to the hypothesis, I'm open to all hypotheses. I think it's possible that ownership comes from that kind of first person experience. I don't know how that works, by the way. I have no idea truly, like how first person experience in my body would lead to normative concerns about bodily rights, but it's possible at least. Second though, you asked, are there any candidate, conditions where you might see ownership blindness? And quite a few people have thought it might be autism again, actually. And so, I mean, several grad students have come to me, it's not my idea at all, several grad students have come to me with this idea, but if you look at some early reports, like, I'd have to look it up, I don't remember that, people have noted that children with autism often have very little regard for property. They do not show a lot of awareness of other people's property, so they'll go into a space and they'll start exploring it, even though it's someone else's like house, right? And similarly, I had a student who, actually Karen Neary, who does a lot of work with children with autism, and she noted that they do a lot of training about possessions. Like, this is yours, this is mine, like labeling over and over and over again in the autism training. So there's been one study so far of looking at autism and ownership, but it wasn't the kind of study with anything remotely like this. So I think it's at least a possibility.
Thank you.
Back there, behind, yep.
So my question is about the cultural, non-cultural aspect. So, you know, there was this BBS article about the idea that we all study the weird people, you know, and it seems like this research has a really important connection to that question, right? So if the real question is, to what degree is this cultural, what about comparing it across cultures, right? Certainly our culture is probably among the most mind cultures around, and so how do kids acquire the notion of ownership in cultures that are, you know, at the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of ownership? I mean, even with respect to body, right, there's this lore that people in different cultures come closer or further away from people, but certainly you might imagine that works differently. Have you done that? Have other people done it? Do you predict that there would be complete invariance? Would it go against your theory to show that there isn't invariance?
Yeah, okay. I'd love to do it, but I can't. I guess I could if I was like some kind of genius of like managing resources and going to like far off cultures, but I don't know how to do that. But luckily other people have. So I think the best published case is Philippe Rochat's paper in cognition. He went to, I think it's seven cultures, and it was really quite diverse. I think it included like a communist school in China, it included like, I think he had street kids like in Brazil. It was really quite a diverse population. And, you know, there's a limited amount of tasks he could do. He was looking at cases where he had like stories where there's two characters who come upon an object, and he would say each of them would have some claim to the object. Like one would say, I've seen it before. Another would be like, you know, he had different, like had made it, for example. He did find some variation among the cultures, but he also found commonalities. So for example, by age 5 in all of the cultures, creation always won. So having made an object gave you rights to it more than anything else. And that was common to all the cultures, like the 7 or whatever cultures you looked at. That's one example. Another example of cross-cultural work, the AHRC, there's a grant from them that was given to a group of researchers that was, I guess Stephen Lawrence at Sheffield was the leader, but Clark Barrett at UCLA was, there was a few people anyway, I won't say all the names, but they did a project where they went to a ton of field sites around the world and did tasks, including ownership tasks. And the data has been sitting there for like 3 years, fully collected. And I don't know why we haven't written it yet. But basically, at least in the adult data, there was incredible commonalities. Even when you're looking at again, very, very diverse, there's a lot of commonalities in how ownership judgments looked across the cultures. But I agree with you, it's a totally important question. Yeah, sorry?
I mean, I guess that's not really, you know, I think that first of all, the kids is where you'd want to look, right? Because what you're saying is there's stereotyped, maturationally linked developmental pattern. The question is, are kids earlier or later in cultures where ownership is less emphasized? It isn't, I mean, I don't know how hard it is. You might even go to...
No, they did kids too, but I'm less aware of what the data looked like again.
Right.
But there was one study on the first possession stuff that suggests it's quite a bit later. So they went to Africa, to 2 field sites in Africa. It's in child development, it just came out. It's Kangasur, Rossano, and I think Tomasello. They claimed that they only found the first possession thing at, I think it was age 9. The only thing I would note though is that the tasks they did were conducted very, very differently. But look, I completely agree with you. It's something that needs to be done and that has been done a little bit and we need more of it.
I guess my more question, I'm sorry, is just to ask what you think about that, right?
Yeah, okay.
Does that go against what you're saying or is that consistent with what you're saying? The fact that the kids are acquiring it at age 9, does that contradict your theory or are you comfortable?
I'd be more concerned if it was the ownership rights half that was slower, frankly. But I guess this is the real answer. Here's what I would predict anyway, or hope for. I would hope that in cultures that have less emphasis on bodily rights, or at least where if there was variation in one, I'd hope it was mirrored in the other. That's, I guess, the thing I'd most hope for. So let's say there was some culture. So actually, for example, even traveling to India, I remember being jostled on buses, and there's a very different notion of personal space in regards to your body, right? I would think on the notions that I've said here that maybe you'd expect that to be mirrored with property too. Because you can imagine it being some kind of calibration where you can't expect these things to be exactly the same in all cultures. So maybe if I can help myself to your stuff, maybe it's also more acceptable if I put my arm on you and pat your back for a second, that kind of thing.
I think we'll have to have one more question. Alfonso. Sorry.
Sure, you go ahead.
No, it's okay.
By the way, I'll talk to all of you all day long if you want.
I was wondering whether you might speculate about some other broader issues. Historically, ownership has taken many different forms. The king owned everything, including the bodies of people. Karl Marx wrote about alienation of labor. You've been insisting on the value of creation as ownership, and yet modern societies built around, and Marx and Hegel discussed this issue, the fact that no, you don't own the product that you produce. What are your thoughts on this? Are you saying that in fact the societies are going to be pathological because we're violating this basic principle that ownership derives from production, and yet the societies are built in a way that violates that basic principle?
Yeah. This is, my dad grew up in a kibbutz back when they were really extreme and you didn't really own stuff, and his stories always seemed filled with bitterness. And I have to say that, I'm probably just confabulating if I'm saying that with an influence in this, but it is a funny thing where there's a guy who's being raised when your parents aren't really your parents, and he told stories where his dad would come back with something and give it sort of to him, and then everyone would use it, and then it was ruined, and he didn't really seem thrilled about the whole thing. And so I guess there's this difference between what is stated. You're saying there was societies where the king owns anything, right? If you find gold in land, it's the king's. My body, it's the king's, right? It's one thing what's stated. It's another thing what's actually how people were thinking about it. And I guess that's the thing I'd want to know. And this is kind of the cross-cultural thing. In the end, we don't have the data of how people were actually living and thinking about this stuff. I might say technically this isn't take my office computer, right? My office computer belongs to the university. That computer also belongs to the university. But nobody thinks about it like that 99% of the time, right? Even if on paper that's the university's, everyone acts, including the university, as if it's mine, right? And similarly, if the king is stated to own things, it could be that 95% of the interactions, we still act as if this is my sock that I'm wearing right now, and not the king's sock.
Now, use rights. And use rights have a very different kind of structure than ownership rights.
It could be that I'm talking about use rights then, the way you're going to me, that's not. I think that's more like the name you want to call something. If you want to say everyone had use rights, and those use rights that they had happened to almost perfectly mirror ownership rights, then I'll be sure, I'm confusing use rights and ownership rights. To me, it's not about, to me, it's basically like this. You have very small kids, very, very small kids, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. They seem to have some notion. They say, this is mine. They know what that means in terms of what other people can do with it. They say, you cannot use it, I can't. If you want to call that all use rights and say they don't have a true understanding of ownership rights, because secretly it all belongs to their parents, I'm okay with that. That's fine. To me, the point is, though, that they've got this notion of, no, because it's just a name, right? The main point is that they've got this notion of these norms that govern our everyday interactions with property that are very, very simple, and exactly what we call it. But, and so that's it.
Well, that's a good note on which to end this session. Thank you very much, Ori.
Thanks.
Can I remind everybody to be back here promptly at 11?
Oh, yeah.
At 11:15. 11:15.